I was standing in a villa I hadn't paid for, clutching keys I hadn't earned, listening to a man promise me an orchard that didn't exist. I didn't realize I wasn't falling in love. I was the primary investor in a psychological Ponzi scheme where the payout is always someday, and the cost is your entire life. By the end of this, you'll know exactly how to spot the future fake before it bankrupts your soul. The air in the house smelled of fresh paint, expensive floor wax, and the faint, lingering scent of possibilities that felt just within my reach, like a perfume that haunts a room long after someone has left. It was the kind of scent that makes you want to take a deep breath and close your eyes, believing that everything that came before, the loneliness, the bad dates, the feeling of being overlooked and undervalued, was just a bad dream from which you had finally awakened into the sunlight. He stood behind me, his hands resting on my shoulders with a weight that felt like grounding at first, a steady, solid presence that promised protection in an unpredictable world. I could feel the heat radiating from his palms through my thin sweater, a warmth that I interpreted as comfort rather than the possessive, predatory grip it truly was. He leaned in, his breath warm against my ear, and for a moment, the world outside these walls ceased to exist. He spoke with a velvet tone, a cadence that suggested we were the only two people on earth who truly mattered. But as I look back now with the clarity of distance and the scars of experience, I realize that weight was the first indicator of a heavy, suffocating restraint that would eventually tighten around my entire existence until I could barely draw a breath of my own. He was whispering into my ear about the orchard we would plant in the backyard of this villa 3 years from now, describing the specific type of heirloom apples, the crispness of the air in the autumn, and the way the golden light would hit the trees in the late afternoon. He spoke with such poetic conviction and such granular detail that I could almost see the fruit hanging from the branches and feel the damp grass between my toes, even though the yard outside was nothing but overgrown weeds, discarded construction materials, and cracked dirt. I was intoxicated by a vision that did not exist in the physical realm, a ghost of a future meant to haunt my present and keep me compliant. He hadn't even paid the security deposit yet. In fact, his credit card had been declined at dinner an hour earlier, an annoying bank error, he claimed, with a flick of his wrist and a charming, practiced smile at the waitress that suggested he was far above such trivial financial mishaps. I remember the way he sighed, as if the bank's incompetence was a personal burden he had to bear for the sake of our grand future, shaking his head at the unfairness of it all with a tired, noble expression that made me feel like I needed to protect him from the world's mediocrity. I felt a surge of loyalty, a need to prove that I was the one person who would never let him down, even as his own foundations were made of sand. But in that moment, standing in that quiet house, with the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long orange shadows across the unfinished floors, and highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny stars, the dream he was painting was so vivid, so intoxicating, that it felt more real than the cold draft coming through the window or the empty cupboards. I felt that familiar, high-voltage rush in my chest, a surge of adrenaline and dopamine that I mistook for passion, destiny, and the arrival of a once-in-a-lifetime connection. I told myself this was soulmate love, the kind of legendary bond people write books and compose symphonies about, the kind that justifies every sacrifice and overlooks every red flag. I told myself I was finally being seen by someone who understood my potential, my secret heart, and my worth in a way no one else ever could or would. But deep down, in that quiet, ignored place in my gut, the place I kept trying to drown out with his grand promises and loud declarations, I knew I was buying into a psychological Ponzi scheme. I thought we had soulmate love, but it turns out it was love bombing, a calculated and relentless flood of affection designed to sweep my common sense away before I could see the man behind the curtain. This is the reality of the future fake. It is a buy now, pay never arrangement designed to keep you invested in a mirage while the sand shifts beneath your feet, leaving you stranded in an emotional desert with no map, no water, and no sense of direction. He wasn't just lying about a house or a wedding or a trip to Italy. He was using my own deepest aspirations, the things I had whispered to him in confidence during those late-night talks when I thought I was safe and understood, to enslave me to his current needs. He took my dreams, polished them until they glowed like gold, and sold them back to me at a price I couldn't afford to pay. He made me feel like the gatekeeper of our shared happiness, placing the burden of the now on my shoulders, while he lived exclusively in the future. Every time I reached for the fruit of his promises, he moved the goalposts just a little further back. I was funding his ego with my absolute devotion, my time, my physical labor, and my mental health, waiting for a payout that was never coming, like a gambler putting their last dollar into a machine that has been programmed by the house to never hit the jackpot. I realized that the more he talked about someday, the less he did today. The grander the vision became, the more the current reality crumbled into dust and disappointment. I was living in a perpetual state of waiting, anchored to a version of him that didn't exist in the physical world. A phantom partner who lived in the clouds while I lived in the trenches, paying the bills and making excuses to our friends and family. When I finally gathered the courage to bring up the fact that he hadn't looked for a job in weeks, that he was sleeping until noon while I worked double shifts to cover the rent, and that our bank account was dwindling to nothing, he pivoted with the grace of a seasoned performer who had played this role 1,000 times. He didn't answer the question. He didn't offer a plan. He didn't show a shred of accountability. Instead, he turned it back on me with a sharp, defensive edge, gaslighting my concerns and asking why I was worrying about small-minded things like monthly bills and electricity when we were busy building an empire together. He used a tone of condescension, as if my concern for food on the table was a sign of my own spiritual poverty. He painted me as the person with the lack of vision, the one who was dragging us down with the mundane details of survival, a ball and chain on his soaring ambition. He made me feel small, petty, and unsupportive for caring about basic survival, as if my desire for stability was a personal insult to his genius and his vision. He used my own conscience against me, making me feel guilt for the very things that kept us afloat. It was a masterclass in distraction, a way to keep me looking at the distant horizon so I wouldn't notice the ground giving way beneath my feet. He was harnessing my hope to keep me hooked during the times he treated me like I was invisible or a nuisance, using the promise of the promised land to make the current desert seem like a necessary, noble sacrifice for a greater cause that only existed in his mind. I was a passenger in a car with no engine, being told we were traveling at the speed of light, while the scenery never changed, and the fuel light had been blinking for months. I started to notice the incongruence in every corner of our lives, like cracks appearing in a massive dam that I was desperately trying to hold together with my bare hands and sheer willpower. It became a game of detective work for my own sanity, a constant, exhausting checking of his words against the stark, undeniable reality of his actions. I began to keep a mental tally of every promise made and every promise broken, realizing that the math never added up, no matter how I tried to justify it. I would look at the calendar and see the dates of missed appointments and forgotten anniversaries, while he looked at the same calendar and saw only opportunities for more lies and more grandiosity. He would name our future children on a Tuesday, discussing their education, their hobbies, and their names, with tears of simulated joy in his eyes, creating a whole universe of shared meaning that felt sacred. He would describe the family dinners we would have and the traditions we would start, making me feel like I was finally part of something larger than myself. Then, he would completely forget to call me when he said he would on a Wednesday, leaving me staring at a silent phone for hours until the sun went down and the house went dark. feeling a crushing sense of insignificance that felt like a physical weight in my stomach. The silence was deafening, a vacuum where my value should have been, filled only by the ticking of the clock and the sound of my own rising anxiety. I would ask myself how someone who planned a future with me could forget my existence in the present. The speed of the dream was breathtaking, moving from hello to forever in a matter of weeks. But the reality of the man was stagnant, stuck in a loop of excuses, delays, and empty explanations that always led back to his own immediate needs and desires. He was a person who talked about global influence, massive success, and changing the world, but couldn't manage the basic responsibilities of a standard adult, like washing a single dish, paying a bill on time, or showing up when he said he would for the people who supposedly mattered most to him. I was living with a walking contradiction, yet he was promising me the world on a silver platter while he couldn't even provide a copper coin to help with the groceries. I felt a strange, competitive martyrdom starting to take over my personality. I began to take pride in how much I could endure, how much of his emotional and financial weight I could carry without buckling, as if my suffering were a badge of honor that proved the depth and purity of my love. I told myself that I was the strong one, the one who could handle his complexity, the only one who could truly save him from his own demons. I felt indispensable because I convinced myself I was the only one who truly understood his genius, the only one who could manage his volatile moods and see the broken, misunderstood boy beneath the bravado. I was becoming an inverted narcissist, seeking my sense of wholeness only when I was engulfed by his grandiosity, mistaking his expansion for my own growth. I felt monochrome and bored when things were peaceful. I had become addicted to the high-stress adrenaline of his drama and the relief of his temporary praise. I was feeding him what he needed, providing him with a constant, unfiltered stream of admiration and service, just to feel the temporary, flickering glow of his reflected light. I was disappearing into the shadow of a mountain made of smoke, losing my voice and my identity to a man who was nothing more than a collection of mirrored traits and stolen dreams. The turning point happened when the mask didn't just slip. It shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces that I could no longer ignore or glue back together with my desperate excuses. It was a public moment, a small dinner party with people who knew his history better than I did, people who hadn't been blinded by the smoke and mirrors of his charm. We were sitting around a table littered with empty wine glasses and the remnants of a meal I had paid for, when a former colleague of his politely corrected a lie. He was telling about his past career success, a minor detail about a project he claimed to have led, but had actually only assisted on in a minor capacity. It was almost insignificant to anyone else, just a small factual correction in a casual conversation over wine and laughter. But I saw the shift in his eyes. I saw the internal nuclear explosion. His face didn't just get red. He looked visibly disoriented, his eyes darting around the room as if he were looking for an exit from his own skin, searching for a way to escape the harsh light of truth. He looked smaller somehow, as if the air was leaking out of his inflated ego. It was a look of pure, unadulterated panic, followed by a chilling, hollow silence that sucked the air out of the room. It was like his entire internal structure had collapsed because the pillars of his lies had been kicked out from under him by a single sentence of reality. This wasn't a normal injury to his pride. It was a total mortification and of the self. The false self he had spent years building was disabled by a simple, undeniable reality check. At that moment, the room went ice cold, as if the heaters had been cut all at once. He entered a zombie state, a terrifying calm that felt like the eye of a hurricane where the wind had stopped, but the atmospheric pressure was high enough to burst your eardrums. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded with a clinical, robotic precision. But the energy coming off him was impredatory. I realized then that I was the primary witness to his greatest shame, the one person who saw the void behind the curtain. And that made me the ultimate enemy. To survive the internal he was feeling, he had to erase the witness. He had to erase me from his narrative and his life to keep his delusion alive. He couldn't look at me without seeing his own failure reflected back in my eyes. I saw the look in his eyes, a total detachment from reality. And I knew my safety depended on my immediate exit. There would be no talking through this. There would be no soothing his pain or offering a hug, because my pity would only register as a sign of my superiority, which would fuel his rage even further. He didn't want comfort. He wanted to ruin the person who saw him fail. The man I thought I knew was gone, replaced by a cold, vacant shell determined to protect its secrets at any cost. And I knew that if I stayed, I would be the sacrifice he made to regain his composure and rebuild his wall of lies. I left that night with nothing but my phone and the clothes on my back, knowing that the villa and the orchard were all ready to me. I stopped writing checks on funds that hadn't cleared. I stopped listening to the grand visions of someday and started looking at today with brutal, unblinking honesty. I began to document the reality of my life, stripped of his poetic narration, writing down the facts of what actually happened versus what he said happened. I focused on the cold, hard evidence of the present moment, refusing to let him gaslight my memories any longer. I looked at my bank statements, my calendar, and my own tired reflection. I realized that the house in Italy, the orchard in the backyard, and the empire we were building were all just shadows on a wall, puppets moved by a master of illusion. If the man in front of me couldn't handle the truth of a dinner party conversation or the responsibility of a simple phone call, he certainly wasn't going to build an empire with me or anyone else. I had to reclaim my own dreams, the ones I had handed over to him like a gift, and realize they were being held hostage by a person who was using them as bait to keep me in a cage of his own making. I began to see the future fake for what it was: a hook with no bait, a promise with no foundation, and a story with no ending. I understood that my hope was being weaponized against me to keep me compliant, subservient, and perpetually waiting for a dawn that would never come. To protect yourself, you must shift your focus entirely to the present moment. You have to become a scientist of your own life, observing data points rather than listening to stories. You must detach your emotions from his words and attach your logic to his actions. Ignore every word spoken about the future, no matter how beautiful or poetic it sounds, and judge the relationship strictly on the actions happening right now. Look at the balance sheet of your life. If there is a constant, yawning gap between what is promised and what is delivered, you are being exploited. Perform micro-tests on the small things. If a person cannot keep a promise to call at 5 o'clock in the afternoon or pick up a gallon of milk on the way home, do not trust them with your retirement, your safety, or your heart. These small failures are the blueprint for the larger ones that will eventually wreck your life and leave you in ruins. Don't build a mansion on a foundation of quicksand. Acknowledge if you have become addicted to the high-stakes rush of the cycle. If healthy, stable people feel boring to you, recognize that this is not because they are dull, but because your nervous system has been trained by trauma to respond only to crisis and chaos. You have been conditioned to seek the relief of the reconciliation, the high that comes after the low, the manic joy after the crushing despair, rather than the peace of a stable connection. Your brain is craving the resolution of a conflict that shouldn't exist in the first place, seeking a chemical hit from an source. This is a symptom of the emotional toll the manipulator has taken on you. A conditioning that must be broken with patience, self-care, and professional support if necessary. You must build your autonomy back from the ground up, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. Create a financial and emotional plan that does not involve them in any capacity. Reconnect with the friends and family members he tried to isolate you from, and rebuild those bridges he attempted to burn. Reclaim your hobbies, your interests, and your time. Understand that the person you are dealing with does not love you in the way you understand love. They love the function you perform as a source of admiration and support. You are a utility to them, a tool to be used until it is blunt, not a partner to be cherished and respected. If you ever witness a moment of total psychological collapse or mortification in a manipulator, where their lies are exposed and their world stops spinning, remove yourself from the environment immediately. Do not wait for the explosion. This is the most state they can inhabit, as they may resort to extreme to regain a sense of control over their narrative and silence the truth. Do not try to comfort them or fix the situation. Your presence is a reminder of their failure, and the only clinical solution is distance. High retention, strategic living requires you to be the primary investor in your own life, rather than the silent partner in someone else's illusion. I want you to remember that you are not alone in this, and the fact that you can see the pattern now is your greatest strength. It takes a lot of courage to admit that the dream you were sold was never real. But that realization is the first step toward a life that actually belongs to you. You are recovering your time, your energy, and your future from a thief of hearts. If this journey spoke to you, or if you felt that same cold draft of a future that never arrives, please consider subscribing and giving this video a like. Your support helps us reach more people who are still trying to find their way out of the fog. Remember, you are not just a character in someone else's story. You are the author of your own reality. Trust your gut, protect your peace, and never stop building a life that is grounded in the truth. You've got this. I'll see you in the next one.